I was really blunt about it. I was really open. I went back last year to Iran, and I was teaching my grandma to box, and she loved it. She was amazing, actually, and she was very accepting of it. She doesn't really care. She was really accepting of the idea. But I guess like other parts of my family, who for some reason assumed I was 16, even though I'm not. And so when I told them and I showed them videos, they were like, "That's not you. How are you doing that?" And I'm like, "No, that is me, and that is what I do. And whether you accept it or not is really, really not my problem."
Yeah.
And I guess my mum is always like, my mum and dad have always been like, do whatever you want, go down whatever path, as long as it makes you happy and you're not hurting anyone. And so I always went about in life with that mentality.
So, hi everyone, welcome to Unapologetically You with myself, Tulse, and I'm going to introduce my co-host. So my guest co-host today is Nitesh Patel. You've heard from him as he's been a guest on our podcast, and unfortunately Kelly is absent due to family circumstances at the moment. And I'm so pleased to introduce Shakiba today. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in sports and exercise psychology, and her education is further enhanced by her current research towards a doctorate in mental health literacy for female rugby players. She's also founded the Move Training Centre, and she's a BAME ambassador for the University of Portsmouth. Shakiba puts her efforts into creating a network for actioning diversity to shine more light on the refugee and displaced student population. Now, that's only a fraction of what she's actually involved in. So, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out to speak with us as a guest for the Unapologetically You podcast.
It's my absolute pleasure, and it's an honor to be here, and thank you for having me as well.
Welcome.
Welcome. So, Pix, I think you're going to start us off on the questions.
I am, yes. So I think it could be difficult when someone's studying. Obviously, it could be very clinical where someone says, I studied this subject and then I went on to this subject. And now, as you're doing, kind of going towards your PhD. But so understanding is that you picked psychology as your degree. Then you did your master's in, was it sports and exercise psychology?
That's right. Yeah.
And now towards kind of the pursuit of your doctorate is it in mental health literacy for female rugby players?
Yeah.
Now, those are obviously three very specific kind of strands. What would you say from the beginning to the end of what made you pick psychology as a degree, undergraduate degree in the first instance? And then what made you progress towards the master's in that specialism and now towards the doctorate? Was it kind of like a particular path that was quite linear, or where you decided from a young age, or was it kind of you just adapted as you went along?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've always been quite fascinated by just human behaviors, just from a really young age. So I was born in Iran, and I grew up there, and I went to school there up until the age of 9 or 10. And of course, culturally, it's very different in terms of their belief systems, more so probably back then as well, rather than now. It's progressed massively now in terms of the younger generation coming through. But even back then, I didn't quite feel like I fitted the typical norm of a young female from a very young age. I have a twin sister, so both me and her were very sporty. At school, we got told off a lot for running around. You weren't allowed to run. And so I guess from a very young age, I was just fascinated by our differences as humans. And then moving to England at about 10 was the biggest cultural shock of my life, even until now. And so again, that fascination just grew even more and more. And I guess I wanted to understand myself to the best in the best possible way that I could. And I think that really helped me communicate in different aspects of my life, whether that's my business, whether that's my relationships with my partner, or with my friends and family. And I think I come to understanding that and everyone is different, and that not everyone's going to have the same perceptions at me. And so that drew me to psychology very naturally. And I was always fascinated by the brain, and like even as a young child, I remember my first book from the library was this book. I still have it. I never gave it back. At my junior school, and it was about how the brain works. And even though I couldn't read it because my English was terrible, I didn't know how to speak or read or write English when I moved here. And so I just got it for the pictures because I was like, some cool pictures of brains in here. And just from then on, I guess I was like, okay, how can I pursue this as a career? I just want to learn a bit more. So it was more so from a learning perspective that I went forward with psychology. And then in Portsmouth, the course was literally perfect for me because it highlighted different aspects of psychology, especially in animals. And I loved that part of it. And that's what really attracted me towards the course, was that it was looking at animal behavior, and that was really interesting. I actually wanted to pursue the forensic psychology, but we had this 2-hour lecture from a very well-known investigator. He's always on Channel 4 doing loads of talks. And he gave this massive talk about some of the cases dealt with, and he told us about this, basically this serial killer who just targets women, especially at night. And I remember going back to my house, I cycled as fast as I could, and I told my housemates, don't knock on my door, I just need to process what just happened. And I just went over in my head, I was like, am I the kind of person who would take the stuff home? And yes, I am, because I get so emotionally attached to things. And then at that time, I just started my journey in competing as an amateur boxer, and there was a lot of struggles that came with that, and especially mentally. And I just drew me towards that path of, okay, what's actually going on in my head when I'm competing? Those pre-bout nerves, when I'm in there, when I come out. And so it drew me to that path very naturally. And Dr. Neil Weston from the University of Portsmouth gave this really interesting lecture, and he ended up being my supervisor, and he's still my supervisor now, doing my PhD. And I think his passion really reflected what I suppose psychology could be as a career. And again, I fell in love with it, and I fell into the master's course on a scholarship basis, luckily. And everything just aligned. The thing was meant to be. And then my PhD kind of came when I was working on a project looking at physical activity rates in patients with schizophrenia, and how that's used as a natural tool to combat the symptoms of schizophrenia. And I fell in love with that side of sports psychology, more so the mental health side of it, rather than the practitioner side and the performance side of it. So it was all a very natural process, but I think because of my involvement in sport from a young age, and also the competitive elite side of it, it really drew me to just studying a bit more, and just, I guess, understanding my own behaviors as well as others around me as well.
That's really interesting. I think it's not only your background that kind of interested me, and obviously John had recommended you to come on this podcast as a guest, but I've always been a fan of psychology. So for me, it's like trying to learn a little bit more about psychological behavior. Why do people do certain things? And I actually did social sciences for my degree. So when it came to criminology and psychology and sociology, like amalgamated into one, I was like, this is really interesting. Is in like, are you born with certain traits, or do you actually learn it from different peers, from different circles and your tribe and community and things like that? So I'm completely in awe of what you're actually doing, and in admiration of actually pursuing your goal. But when you talk about creating change for female athletes' mental health, it's not really a subject many people are actually hearing about, especially, well, it's not really discussed. It's not a high topic of conversation at the moment. Why did you actually lean into this particular topic, and what are the key outcomes that you want to diversify within your research? Like what is the purpose of it, and what made you go into it, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I accepted the PhD, or I was accepted onto it even, my research, my master's, was really focused on the challenges experienced by female amateur boxers. And again, that was based on my own experiences. And what was interesting to find, what I found through the research was that actually a lot of women in male-dominated sports experience very common challenges. That for me was really interesting. That was interesting finding at that time. So this was in 2015. At that time, there was no research on it really. That kind of, it still isn't, to be honest. That explored that kind of area in terms of, okay, what does it mean to be a female in a male-dominated sport? What kind of challenges do you experience? And there is certain challenges that women experience when they're in male-dominated spaces that men just do not. And for example, one of them was the societal pressures of appearing to be feminine, and then you have to balance out this feminine concept of your life with this masculine sport that you're competing in. And through that process of being involved in masculine sports, people assume your sexuality, people assume your likes and dislikes, and there comes that massive pressure that you have to prove yourself, that you are good enough to be here because it's male dominated, but actually I'm good enough to also be a female. And that balance, I see it a lot, or at least I saw it a lot in boxing. And then when I actually pursued the study side of it, I was like, yeah, this is actually real. And I almost just confirmed my own theories in my head. Like, firstly, this isn't just how I feel, it's very common. But also a lot of other females in male dominated sports experience this. And for example, talking about females' menstrual cycle was like a complete no-no. And this is something that I work with England boxing and GB coaches in 2019 about. We need to have this open conversation about menstrual cycle, because it is something that is a very natural process. It is as natural as breathing, and so we should be speaking about it. And actually it massively influences a woman's performance, and actually places women under certain susceptibilities in terms of their performance, but also that they can become injured given what phase of the menstrual cycle they're in. And nobody really wanted to hear it, because especially a lot of male coaches within a boxing gym are like, oh no, I don't want to speak about that, that's rank. And I'm like, well, actually, if your mum didn't have a period, you wouldn't be here. It is literally as simple as that. And it is breaking it down in that way. And I think because I was so used to being in boxing gyms and around a certain type of crowd, which I absolutely loved, because it was so different from academia. I could just say whatever I wanted in whatever language I wanted, and I enjoyed that relaxed atmosphere. But at the same time, there was a lot of ignorance towards certain topics, which within different societies you get anyway. So it's not surprising. And because male populations don't experience the menstrual cycle, some are not understanding, whilst others are very understanding. So that was one of the main reasons, was based on my own experience and my experiences of my friends. And then when I went into this PhD, it was actually perfect timing. This PhD was actually proposed. It was a proposed title. It wasn't to do with women. It was just looking at mental health literacy in rugby. I interviewed for it, and then once I got accepted, me and my supervisor, Dr. Paul Koninsky, he was like, right, that was my idea, looking at mental health literacy, but what's your twist on it? And we looked at research, and then we both found that actually there is literally no research on women rugby players. And I discussed my previous research, and I was like, look, these are the challenges that a lot of women in boxing experience, and I think actually this could mirror some similar challenges in rugby. And he was all for it, and he was like, yeah, let's do it, let's look at this. So I was quite lucky to have Paul as a supervisor, because he's very hands-on. He's like, yeah, let's go, I like this idea. He even wanted to do a project on boxing, and I was like, we'll have to leave that for another year. So it was really nice to have a supervisor who was so keen on looking at things the same way as I did, but he was so passionate about the same topics as I was, given also that he's a male. But he was like, why do we need to look at male? We need to look at females. And I was like, okay, this guy is passionate, this is good. And yeah, just when I realized there's literally no research, and I had these, I guess in my own head, assumptions, there's going to be so much research on this because it's such an important topic. And I'm literally, just before this call, I was just working on my review, that's just finishing now. And the review is looking at what research is currently out there on mental health of rugby players. And there isn't actually much, let alone in females. There was only one study that I found that had 49 women rugby players, included in the study, but they also had 150 male rugby players, so it's disproportionate in terms of the ratio. And of course, 49 rugby players is not representative of the worldwide population of rugby players. And then I found another 8 studies that looked at male rugby players. So far more representative, but again, 8 studies looking at mental health is in a sport where concussion rates are high, where you have early retirement due to injuries. And of course, with concussion rates, early retirement comes more susceptibility to experiencing symptoms of mental health, especially depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms. And so for me, that was a massive shock, still is, to be honest, that there's literally barely anything out there on this sport, given how traditional the sport is as well. It's been around for years. But again, it's a masculine sport, and there's this stigma around it that if we speak about mental health, people might think I'm weak, or I might not be picked for the first team, or I might look weak in the media. And so it's actually removing all that stigma. And I guess the purpose of this is to bridge the gap in literature in terms of its academic purposes. But at the same time, we want to work on an intervention at the moment that we just put the ethics in for, which is just to help improve mental health literacy within that cohort of women rugby players, but also look at their attitudes towards help seeking, look at their intentions towards help seeking, just to try and understand this population better. So for future research, there's actually a foundation there to say, okay, this is the measures, this is what we found. Our second study actually found that mental health literacy in women rugby players is actually very high. So their knowledge of mental health literacy is really good. But within that population, for example, those that identify as gay or lesbian are less likely to seek help. And so it's really digging deep into certain populations within this sport, within the female population, that are more susceptible to experiencing symptoms of mental health. And this is where we intervene then. And that kind of data isn't currently available. I think for me, I didn't realize how big this research was up until probably now. And I just think I always say to my supervisor, it is a lot of pressure to get it right, because you're the first person to do it.
Yeah.
It's like, you have to get it right. Otherwise you're going to mess up the foundations, and then the whole building is going to come collapsing. So for me, I'm just like, I need to make sure I get this right. But we're getting there, and I think with the guidance of I have 3, my first supervisor and second and third, I'm in a very good place to wrap things up, hopefully within the next year and a half. But yeah, I'm just hoping that gap is bridged, and I'm hoping that this topic is taken a lot more seriously, because it needs to, especially given the rise in women's rugby within the last 2 years.
Shakiba, can I just ask a follow-up question on that, from what you said? So you said that there was kind of a lack of research having been done in this area anyway. So the one question I had was, within a subset of like the women, as you said, like women who are LGBT, it could be gay women, etc. Have you found the experiences of ethnic minority women have been quite unique and quite different to non-ethnic minority women? Because I imagine there's like a shared experience of discrimination possibly, but there may be some unique perspectives of discrimination, for example, maybe that ethnic minority women experience. And also follow up with that is, how have you found the support amongst ethnic minority women supporting other ethnic minority women? Because often, well, 3 people in this room right now, of where you sometimes get extreme examples of where there's kind of like a natural rivalry amongst ethnic minorities, of where they don't want to, not necessarily they want to see you fail, but they don't want to see you succeed necessarily. And so they're quite insular, and everyone's just doing their own task and their own success. And then you get the extreme end of where people often try to support others, they're trying to encourage them. How have you found that experience in terms of when you were coming up from the degree to now? Have there been ethnic minority women or men who have supported you along the way, or have you found that they haven't done as much as you had hoped, and that you're hopefully helping others with now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think in terms of research in rugby, in women population, there is nothing out there. And so there's a massive gap still. So for my own research, myself and Paul purposely collect data on race and ethnicity, so that we can show that there is no research. And just through the participant pool that we had 208 players, and I can't remember exactly what percentage it was, but it was far less than the representatives we had in other categories. I think for can't remember for I think the category we had was basically what do you identify with, and the more than majority were white women, but also I think we had like 10% of diverse ethnicities, but within that, when you break that down, it was really small. We had like maybe I think 8 Black women and 3 or 4 women from Asian, Middle Eastern cultures as well, which was a massive shock to me. But at the same time, I do understand why that shortage is. And I think there's a lack of representation within, especially male-dominated sports, for females that are from a diverse ethnic background. And I think for the actual females themselves, having spoken to certain women that are from diverse ethnic backgrounds, they've said, you know, their cultures don't see this as socially acceptable. There's that juxtaposition of, okay, you're in a male-dominated sport where a lot of men actually compete here, but you're a woman. So what's that, you know, that you don't fit into this place, you shouldn't be here. And so they have to battle that on top of everything else that comes with that sport. Everything, you know, with rugby, for example, you have the physical demands, you have the psychological demands. As a woman, you have I guess, the average societal demands and pressures. Then you have the cultural demands, you know, if you come from that ethnic background. And so that's 4 different types of pressures you got to deal with, which within all those different pressures are broken down into even more subcategories of pressures in comparison, for example, to the 2 that maybe any other, your average male, white male in rugby would have to experience. And so I think there is a lack of support for diverse ethnic women out there in these male-dominated sports, let alone other sports anyway. But I think in male-dominated sports, a lot of the time, there's a massive clash with their cultural background and beliefs. For example, there was a girl I interviewed, and she said she had to, this was in boxing, and she had to hide the fact that she boxed from her mum for 4 years, given that she was national champion 3 times. And it was only recently when she was going to the Olympic qualifiers that she had to tell her, because she was going to be on TV. And it was only then she had to break the news to them. And you know, she really described her journey on how she had to break the news and how nerve-wracking it was that it could have ended a boxing career. Luckily, I say luckily, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but they seemed to be very supportive by the end of it. She's now turned professional. So it's really great to see, but I know that not every single person from a different culture has that understanding. And then sometimes it's not necessarily actually their cultures that's stopping them, it's the pressures from society that stops them. So you can have a very understanding family, but actually the pressures you get from society just become too much. And it's that, like you said, I guess, other people looking at you like, I don't want you to do well. So I don't want you to do well. So there are unnecessary pressures.
I think the difficulty could also be as well is that there's so many layers to, like, a female boxer. There's like 10 different strands that even get to that point. So for an ethnic minority to even say that they want to do possibly marketing, for example, well, if the expectation is that you've got to go into medicine, you've got to be an accountant, you've got to be a solicitor, it's so remote then that even if you get through the first hurdle that you don't do accountancy and you do marketing, well, to get to a female boxer, that's like 10 steps removed from there. And so we've got probably like a first layer problem, let alone the 10th layer. And I can imagine it would be nerve-wracking even just to broach the subject of maybe even taking it on as a hobby, let alone as a profession. Because if someone said like yourself, well, I want to go into boxing professionally or amateur, that would be just unheard of, let alone just joining a gym. Just going to the gym could be unheard of for some. Just starting to skip could be like weird for some ethnic minorities, for their daughters to do. And possibly even for men in some aspects as well, that ethnic minority men may have a first stage problem of that. Their parents just don't accept that profession as legitimate and just acceptable just generally. So I can absolutely understand that.
I think that Yeah, sorry, Shakiba. All I was going to say was I think that when people are born here, like you weren't born here, but there is a lot of still first generation of people who are born here, but our parents, they're either kind of open and willing to accept these hobbies and diverse career paths, but then there's others who have that traditional, this is what we know from our culture, this is what we know for certain, which requires a good profession, stability, things like that. But I definitely think it's about open-mindedness from our parents and our grandparents as well, and then we're going to be way more open-minded with our kids, right?
No, absolutely. I think that's so right. I think even my own family back at home, certain individuals, they didn't realize how serious it was that I was, competing at a national level. And so I was really blunt about it. I was really open. I went back last year to Iran, and I was teaching my grandma to box, and she loved it. She was amazing, actually, and she was very accepting of it. She doesn't really care. She was really accepting of the idea. But I guess like other parts of my family who for some reason assumed I was 16, even though I'm not. And so when I told them and I showed them videos, they were like, "That's not you. How are you doing that?" And I'm like, "No, that is me, and that is what I do. And whether you accept it or not is really, really not my problem."
Yeah.
Um, and I guess my mum is always like, my mum and dad have always been like, do whatever you want, go down whatever path, as long as it makes you happy and you're not hurting anyone. And so I always went about in life with that mentality. But at the same time, I do understand how it's perceived. Like when some of my like family members, when I went back, for example, my one of my aunties, we went to the mountains, and she was like, "No, you can't go up on your own. You're too
Yeah.
young." And she was like, take that rucksack off. It's too heavy for you. And literally had 2 water bottles in it. And I was like, so I ran 45k, like 45k on mountains with like 10 kilograms in my back for a race. Honestly, think like a half an hour hike with 2 water bottles in my bag is okay. And she was like, no, it's dangerous. What if someone speaks to you? And I was like, last time I checked, I've got a tongue. So, but my way was very jokey. I understand their perspective, and I respect them as my family. And so I always cracked a joke. And luckily, both my grandmas, even though they're from they're like so many generations, like way before me, and yet their mentality towards it is very open, and I'm really grateful for that. And for them, they were like, because she obviously my grandma was the eldest person, and whatever she said went, and she was like, right, she's going, leave her alone, let her go. She was like, just come back here and meet us here in like in half an hour or 1 hour, we'll be here drinking tea. And I was like, all right, cool, bye. Nothing happened. I went up the mountain and came down, and guess what? Nothing happened. So that was that's interesting, and I guess like again coming back here, I understand the cultural differences massively. I think going back on the point of like the support system, that there is nothing currently that exists that provides the support. I think you find that within your circles you end up supporting others that experience the same problems as you. And so I did meet people from different ethnicities in terms of them being from Middle Eastern cultures, being from Caribbean cultures, being from different African cultures, and it was really interesting, and I loved meeting them through boxing itself, and that's why I love the sport. It is a very diverse sport, and some of our experiences were really similar in terms of how we're perceived in society, how we're perceived as women. So that, for example, at one of the national cups I was competing at, it was a 3-day cup, and so at night time we'd go out and get food, and just happened to bump into a referee there who seemed to have a bit too much to drink, and he was like, "Oh, so you compete today? Well done." And I was like, "Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm through to the finals tomorrow." He was like, "Yeah, good luck, but I don't think you should be doing it." And I was like, "What? Oh, what? What do you mean?" And I was like, "What did you say?" He was like, "Yeah, you shouldn't be doing it." And I was like, "Oh, okay. How come?" He's like, like little girls like yourself shouldn't be in there, girls shouldn't be in there, don't want to ruin that little pretty face." And I was like, oh my God, this is like my worst nightmare, really. I don't want to, I wanted to punch this guy in the gut so hard, but I was like, I need to walk away from this. And he was like, I wouldn't want to see my daughter in there. And I was like, yeah, maybe because she doesn't want to do it, but I do. And like my dad comes and watches all my fights, and he's really proud of it. But maybe, and then he just kept cutting me off, being like, no, women don't belong in the ring. And I was like, okay. sure, 4 years down the line, we have so many professional fighters in this country now. I had a professor at uni question my involvement when I actually initially wanted to do my undergraduate dissertation. He was from, I can't remember where he was from. I think it was Professor, he said he was Indian, but he never said what part of India he was from. And he said, I went into him and I had to go to him because he specialized in qualitative projects. And so he said, yeah, I know I can help you. And then he said, oh, tell me about your project. And so I went through all my proposal with him. And his first question after a 10-minute presentation was, oh, I'm guessing your parents don't approve of you boxing. And I was like, how is that relevant to my research? And why would you assume that? And we got into this massive, like, not argument, I guess, heated debate, I like to call it, about how he was wrong and I was right, because my mum and dad didn't care. And they were like, he was like, what if you break your nose? And I was like, well, what if you trip up and break your nose?
Absolutely.
Like, do you know what I mean? There's just as many risks as you walking down the road as there is me breaking my nose in the ring. 4 years later, I still haven't broken my nose, touch wood. So I'm just like, it's just that those prejudgments and prejudice that it still exists in people that we're meant to put our trust in, like a judge, like a professor. So
have you found progress? Have you found progress, like from when you started your degree? I know it's different then, because as an undergraduate, you wouldn't have been going to professors as much, but have you found it's kind of developed the tolerance a little bit, or is it still as backward as it was maybe 10 years ago?
I would say it's definitely developed and it's progressed, but not quick enough. I think there's been every possible chance to progress quickly. For example, we see how the world adapted, especially in education or in big industries, how everything adjusted to COVID and to battling COVID. And my argument is always that is a proven approach that if you want something quick enough, your approach will change so that you achieve a certain outcome in a given time. And so we should always challenge diversity problems, racism, discrimination as quickly and as urgently as we dealt with COVID. Yeah, that we don't see that because for some people it's not an urgent thing. And I think it goes back to who sits at the top, and for them it's not an urgent matter. And so that's why the progression hasn't been as quick as I would like it and many other people would like it. Again, I always say I don't necessarily represent and I think it is wrong of me to sit here and say I represent other people from different diverse ethnicities, because luck has played a huge part in my, especially education experience, because I've had supervisors and mentors who have been just so understanding. And although they've been white, they are still so understanding of the concepts that I may experience as a young Iranian refugee, ex-refugee, I guess, former refugee, that they understand some of the challenges that I experience. But I know that not every single person from a similar background has that. And I know the university last year brought in the BAME ambassadors, but that was really mainly on the back of the BLM movement last year.
Yeah.
And I think because everything happened, they were like, right, we need to act. And I think that's good. And I actually really like the fact that it's a paid role and that it's not, come and volunteer for us. I think that volunteer aspect of such a crucial role takes away the value of what we're actually trying to do. Mm-hmm. And that's been another thing that I've really been driving for, is that these roles within industries, they can't be volunteered because you're devaluing the person and their experiences instantly by asking them to talk for free, to asking them to come and present your stuff for free for the sake of them increasing the understanding of your staff or whoever that talk is to. And luckily, again, I like the approach that the uni have taken, but it's just, I guess time will tell in terms of have the people at the top listened to what we've said so far? Are they going to take on board what we've said? We want to implement the zero tolerance policy to racism. Is that going to get implemented as efficiently, as quickly that the COVID regulations were put into place? Like we always say in our meetings, racism is its own pandemic. And so we need to be dealing with that. We are driving to change the term BAME because none of us like the term. I think it's so wrong to squish anyone who's in white into one term. And I keep saying to them, like, we're on the topic of disciplinary panels. and you know, they were like, tell us your opinion about how you think this should be. And I said, obviously there needs to be a fair representative. And they were like, okay, how about if we have a BAME individual on it? And I was like, no, it's not just about, it's not a tick box exercise. It's not about just chucking a BAME person, because prejudice exists within the BAME communities, you know. And I use the example of like how certain cultures perceive women that are in high power positions, and they don't like that because they don't view women as equals. And so what if someone with that perception, that cultural understanding, that belief system sat on that panel and viewed me, and then actually their judgments then affected my future and my career. And I was trying to get this across, and it's like a lot of these industries, really important industries, don't have that cultural context, don't have that cultural perspective of, and it's understandable because certain things don't exist here. But at the same time, that's why you go and seek these kind of advice from different individuals who may have a different experience. And then another thing, I guess, was that we need a support. Everything goes back to a support system for me. I think with my research in mental health, it's just become so clear that there isn't, that there's this massive need for a safety net. And when you go to BAME, for the sake of this conversation, to BAME individuals, you know, and you ask, tell us about your experiences, tell us, you know, what it's like to come through the education system, and talk about some of the challenges. Like, and I've had that asked in a meeting from a white individual, and I just think for you to ask that such an open question to in front of all your colleagues, not only are you putting me under pressure, but also you may be bringing up things that have been traumatic for me. And when it comes to trauma, that's a big no-no for me.
It's personal, isn't it? You can't just divulge everything in a, 30-second bio, can you? You can't just do that.
Absolutely. And I think when he asks, and then it comes from a lack of understanding. It's not done out of like, I don't like you, so I'm going to embarrass you in front of everyone. It is genuinely out of a lack of understanding. And so I think, I explained to him afterwards, when you put someone on the spot, and it was me and another colleague, when you put someone on the spot, you need to provide this. And it's weird because some of them are psychologists in that room, yet no one picked up on this.
Your experience as an Iranian woman, it's quite different than my experience as an Indian male, and likewise for Tulsi. And yet it's kind of this all-encompassing term that, I don't know, a board of a FTSE 100 company, for example, if they have one ethnic minority, is as if that one singular individual represents all ethnic minorities in existence. And it's clearly crazy. In the same way, a person who's earning more than £100,000 and someone who's on benefits, they live quite a different lived experience. They're not the same people, and there are kind of unique, obviously, challenges that each kind of group can have. And so I absolutely agree with you on the BAME term, that it's sometimes like an easy catch-all term for individuals and groups in society to just kind of lump us together, and often just as a tick box, just so they can say, we're representing BAME communities, we've got a BAME individual on our board or as an employee. But what that actually means is substance in furthering all people of ethnic minority backgrounds. It's a completely different thing, obviously. So,
but then I jump in on that as well to say, if you're hiring based on a representative and you're just putting people as a tick boxing exercise, the only thing is, there are certain situations where you are put in a boardroom, where you're put in a meeting, where you are surrounded by dominant males. And if anybody has been in that type of situation, any female, I'm not even talking about multicultural people and diversity in our ethnicity, but in talking about females who often get kind of talked down to, they get interrupted, and being in that scenario sometimes suppresses the actual ideas and information that the woman wants to come across as anyway. So actually being brought up in a culture where, Shakiba, you said earlier, your nan was like, oh, we don't lift that, you're a girl, and like, be careful, and you can't drive on your own, and things like, it's all these different things, amalgamation of the biases that we've been brought up in our culture. But it doesn't necessarily change when you're in a new environment, because that's not who you've been or experienced. It's a new situation in that aspect as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one thing that people need to consider, especially if you sit at a really high position within an industry, you need to understand what people's norms are. So my norm will be different to someone who sits very high up as a white male. And so, you know, my norm will be different to their norm because of our cultural differences, because of our gender, because they may have a different sexual orientation to me. And so it's really important that we understand that everyone's norm is not our own personal norm, and that's where that difference comes in. And that's why, you know, language is so important, and the way you speak to people is so important, and that you don't use terms that could come across as derogatory, or terms that could be deemed as offensive or racist or discriminative. And so it's important that you use the right terminology, and unfortunately that hasn't been put into place properly in a lot of institutions, not just, I guess, in a university level, not just in my experience is reflective of my university, and it doesn't represent other students in other universities, because some of the things I hear from other universities are just horrific. And at least there is some sort of support system within my university that I know I can go to, and actually they're very supportive. But yeah, and I think, again, everything goes back to a support system. I think reflecting on the term BAME and how that makes someone feel, and the way you're labelled is not right. I think asking someone again to talk about the experiences, which in a lot of cases could be traumatic, because we're talking about racism, we're talking about physical abuse, we can talk about harassment, sexual harassment, physical harassment, verbal harassment, and then for someone to, you know, ask to open up for the sake of, again, a group of people understanding. And I think what's worse is that you're still putting yourself at risk, because someone within that group, and this has happened right in front of my own eyes, someone turns around and questions your experience. Actually, if you'd done this in this scenario, maybe it might have come across different. Maybe you wouldn't see it in that way, or maybe that person didn't actually mean that. And it's like you're invalidating someone's experience by asking those kind of questions. Now, I don't know if that comes from a place of naivety, stupidity, being a pretty horrible human being, or actually you just literally don't know. But those kind of questions can literally trigger someone, and they could go into this downward spiral, which at the end of it could lead to something really horrific. And I think, you know, and I said this to the person, like, after this meeting, you go away with your little notes that you've taken, how you want to improve equality and diversity, whilst actually that certain individual will now go away and try and deal and cope with, if they have those strategies even, with what has now resurfaced from their traumatic experiences. And who knows if they can even deal with it or not? Who knows what it would lead to? Is there going to trigger some sort of behavior, addictive behaviors? Can they trip into a hole and they can't get out of it? And it's making institutions aware of those circumstances, and that if you're going to ask someone to open up, firstly, you need to provide a safe space where those kind of stupid questions are not asked, by removing those people from that, and then actually delivering that material in terms of experiences to them in a written form that's not coming from the person, which is then protecting that person from those kind of questions. And it was really, someone couldn't understand what I was saying, actually. This was someone quite high up. They were like, well, what do you mean provide a support system? And I had to use quite an extreme example. And I said, imagine you've just come into this situation and people are trying to understand sexual harassment. And so you bring in a rape victim and you have to speak about that topic. And you ask this person, let's talk about some of your experiences when you were getting raped. What was it like? How did you feel? What happened? And then someone in the audience goes, well, maybe actually you wore a short skirt and then maybe that's why you got raped. Actually, maybe the person mistook you for someone and that's why you got raped. As I was talking about this example, I could see people's faces in the camera turning, and I thought, this is trauma. This is what trauma is. This is traumatic experiences, and of course they differ in terms of how extreme me and you can see it. But unless you haven't experienced something, it doesn't give it. Even if you haven't been in that place of that person. You have no right to question anyone's experiences. And so I think at that point I understood what I was trying to say. And so we need to provide a safety net. We need to provide those safe spaces. And these are, some people chuck these words around as buzzwords. You know, we're going to give you a safe space. And I'm like, no, you're not though. You're just using those buzzwords. So it sounds great on your program, but actually you're not providing that. And I just find at the moment that word diversity and equality and, you know, we want to be inclusive. I find that's a buzzword, those kind of words, and they're just getting chucked around at the moment without much meaning. And everyone wants to have an EDI committee now. Everyone wants to have a BAME ambassador within groups of whatever that group is. And I think you're missing the point.
Yeah.
You're really missing the point. It's not about having a BAME individual in your groups. In whatever institution it comes down to understanding and put into place schemes that are supportive of people who really need it. And in this circumstance, we're talking about people who come from diverse ethnicities, from communities that have been disadvantaged because of the system that's been put into place within society. That's what we're talking about. The understanding isn't there at the moment, and I think this is why we need that urgent drive to get it right and get it right quick.
Those are really good points, and it actually goes on to some of the questions I was going to ask is what can companies do? It isn't about creating this role and then filling that role so they can tick box it. You've actually made some really, really good points that some of our audience can actually question that and question their companies and their workplace of how they're going about it and get involved in this area. But we're going to go to some quick fires right now just to round up this whole conversation because it's been so informative already. But say, for example, if people want to get involved in these types of discussions and they want to learn more about this area, where would they go to? Could you give us some examples of some areas or books or podcasts that they could probably, or online forums even? Is there stuff like that available?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is the presence, online presence at the moment has been bigger than ever, especially given the circumstances of everything moving online. So there are a lot of, so LinkedIn Learning, for example, they provide a lot of courses, a lot of talks, whether that's podcasts that they recommend or whether that's the actual lectures. And there's a lot of free, I always say, make use of whatever that's available to you for free. And there's a lot of free resources out there on LinkedIn Learning, and that's a really great resource to go to. And they're actually a really great, credible resource that you can take to your workplace and say, you know what, actually, I saw this on LinkedIn Learning. I think it would be a great seminar to have or something great to send to our staff. That's one place I would go as a credible source. I think there's a lot that's going on in terms of the Twitter movement around this sorts of topics. And so researching a hashtag, as well as it could flag up stuff that is actually quite opposite to it, it does bring in other perspectives that you learn. And something that I work for a cybercrime team, and my supervisor said something really interesting this week. And he said it was about fake news. And he said, actually, don't delete people on your Facebook, on your social media that have really contradictory views to yourself, because actually it's allowing you to come out of your echo chambers and to see how people, because that individual could represent a group of people within a society. And it was like, you can use that as a learning resource of how to actually challenge those individuals. Whereas if you delete them, then you take away that, I guess, vision of other people's perspectives that are not only something, in some cases, absolute nonsense, but you learn to challenge them in the right way. And so I think in that way, Twitter, the platform Twitter could be used in a really positive way. In terms of authors, I follow and read a lot of work done by Akala. I read Loki and some of the stuff he puts out, and listen to his music. He's actually a psychologist, John Aminichi, does a lot of talks, really massive fan of him. Dr. Peter Olosaga, he's very active. He calls himself a loudmouth on Twitter. I think he's a really great, he's a great role model. I really look up to him. For me, it's having those kind of people around me. There's Professor, I can never remember her name when I need it. Professor Bola in, I can't remember what university, but she's written the book White Privilege. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an incredible book, and I would encourage anyone to read it. Just because the amount of times I've heard people say that the term white privilege is apparently a racial slur. It's not. There's tons of research to provide reasons as to why the term white privilege isn't racist. If it was a racial slur, there wouldn't be a professor writing a book on it, which takes away that statement instantly. And I think within I guess those are psychologists and academics that, and I guess music influence that people that I go to. And also Dr. Peter Olosaga runs his own podcast. So I think he provides some great topics on that as well. Some of them are sport related, but also they do dive into some certain topics. And I think I even try and listen and go to things like, it sounds really weird, but every now and then I'll do a hashtag on UKIP just to see what's actually current within their world. As irritating and frustrating it is to read some of their stuff, I go on Katie Hopkins' profile, I go on Nigel Farage's profile, just to actually see what's being circulated. Because one way or another, something's going to come round and that topic will then burst. So yeah, I try and keep informed in those kind of ways, and I guess the opposition, if you want to call it, I try and keep myself informed in terms of what's going on in their world, because I think it's important to.
Shakiba, can I ask you just a follow-up on that as well, related? Like Akala is an interesting of where it's like a historical perspective as well of these things, that it's not often how society is treating us now, but it's the context of what's happened in the past of all of our shared histories, and that there's whether it's when the Indians came over, when Idi Amin chucked them out of Africa, and what the experience has been since. But with the social media aspect, is interesting because there's this whole discussion right now about like banning certain individuals for hate speech online, and you get people who are on both sides of the spectrum, the ones who say social media platforms should allow everyone to express who they are, and no restrictions whatsoever. And then you've got the people saying, well, there are limits to speech, that once it reaches over a certain level of whether it's hate, whether it's yelling fire in a burning room, essentially is saying that there is a limit at some point. With the people like the Katie Hopkins and obviously Trump recently, where do you stand on that discussion of in terms of like banning certain individuals from social media, or are you very much speech is speech and we should just have an open platform where all of us can discuss ideas together? It's obviously not a rapid fire, so it's
I was going to say that's not a quick fire question.
I know, I just went off. It was just more of a curiosity, because because this is the time right now, like Twitter is such a discussion, mainly because of the Trump factor, that whether we ban people online, and I can see it, especially over the next 2-3 years, coming up more and more of how far should speech go and how far should discussion go.
Yep. I think that there's definitely a line to draw with speech. I think there are people on there who are leaning towards becoming extremists, and so they're still active online, and they haven't been banned. And so obviously there is a limit, and I think people like Katie Hopkins, people like Trump, they cross that limit by becoming threatful. And I think the language, again, it goes back to language. The language they use becomes threatening. But again, they do it in a really clever way that it's not necessarily directed, but when you actually look in, and when you just have to read between the lines, to understand what they're trying to get at, and then that influences other people with very extreme views to then allow themselves to express their opinions, and then to mix their opinions up with facts, and that's a complete dangerous platform, is when people think that opinions are facts, and they try and convince others that no, this is the way. For example, I have this conversation a lot, and a lot of my work involves fake news for the cybercrime team. And one example is that the likes of Nigel Farage put up a tweet saying we have illegal immigrants entering our borders, entering our waters, entering our country. Take action now. Stop. Actually, the term illegal immigrants it's very rare to get illegal immigrants in this country because of how strict the travel system is, how strict the policies are around entering the country. The immigration system is and I've gone through that process, so I understand it as well now. It's very strict. You don't just walk into the UK. There's far more easier countries that you can walk into and no one would bat an eyelid. Mm-hmm. In the UK, you don't do that because they have very strict procedures put into place. And for Nigel Farage to say, given his position, he knows his terminology is wrong, but he knows the type of people he's influencing, and that becomes dangerous because those people are not illegal immigrants, they are refugees who will be asylum seekers eventually if they're not deported. And when we look at those people that are crossing via the Mediterranean Sea, it is people who are fleeing false persecution, who are fleeing war, who are fleeing human trafficking, who are fleeing all of our nightmares put into one. They're literally fleeing hell. And for him to label them as illegal immigrants, it's not right. They don't just drop out of the sky into this country and go on about their life. And I think just he creates these misconceptions, about these people. And so now that group of people, for example, refugees, are perceived as dirty illegal immigrants who are now going to become criminals in this country, who are going to now become rapists. And it's the way they use certain things to label people, to label the whole community. And these people that are very extreme in their views believe it because one of their leaders is now actually stating it, and they just start to believe this narrative that is so far from the truth. And there's this theory called the social identity theory, and it talks about why people form within their groups and why we conform to these ideologies and belief systems, and then you abide by them so religiously almost. And it literally comes down to a human just wants to feel like they belong to something. And so, okay, a couple of these things are the same as my views, so I'm going to now belong to it. And when they identify with that group, with that social group, anything that's opposed to that group's perceptions and views and beliefs, they will literally fight with their life to fight against it. And so that's why we see so many keyboard warriors, and that's why we see the spread of fake news has increased dramatically, especially through that lockdown. And people like Nigel Farage, people like Katie Hopkins, just add like fuel to the fire, and they just make it 10 times worse, especially by using terminologies that are not correct. And there was a post that Nigel Farage posted a little while ago about a group of groomers in Birmingham, and they said, oh, these are all men from diverse backgrounds. And actually, when you go into it, the group is a massive group, but the way that the media has portrayed them, they've just picked out the people who are not white, basically, or who are not British. And so that's the way the media portrayed it, was that what you can see is actually, yeah, these people don't look white. And so, okay, this group of people, anyone who looks like them are rapists now. And people actually believe that. People have that ideology of, they will believe what they see.
It's fear mongering, isn't it? It's a case of, well, we can give you all of the evidence that you want, but if their idea and their ideology doesn't suit that, they're not going to accept that information. So you could be the most intelligent person, but if they don't believe that, what's being put in front of them, they're not going to conform to being open-minded and understanding what other people are telling them. It doesn't matter how much research is out there or how much evidence is out there. People will only conform to their level of bias if they want to believe it. So it's really difficult to have those conversations. But I love the fact that you said, don't shy away from it. Like, don't block people, learn from it, understand their perspective and who's actually listening. So I really do like that perspective that you've actually given to us as well.
That's great. I think there's a lot we can do through just talking.
Yeah.
I'm so done with arguing with people. I'm so done with just constant back and forth aggressiveness. And I think there's a lot when you can just sit down with someone. I'd happily sit across a room with someone who may be part of the BNP or UKIP and just have an honest, open discussion. Yeah. I'll tell them about my experiences and they can tell me about theirs, and we can have it open. And at the end of it, we don't have to agree. We can still have opposing views. That's fine. It's just, I want to understand that person. So I want to talk to you without this aggressive nature, without being sat behind a computer or laptop and typing away and having that protection there. I want to get to know someone from the opposition. And I think there's this massive misconception that if you have these views, which is literally just pointing out the realities of things, suddenly you become extreme leftist. I can remember I was having a discussion with someone online about how school meals should be free for people that are at disadvantage, and they were like, oh, you're such a lefty. And I'm like, but when did human rights become a leftist thing? Like, it's not. I'm literally just saying I don't like identifying with groups, but my views are my own. But when did justifying human rights become a lefty thing? What is it not a part of the right groups thing? Of course, surely we should all want human rights for everyone. And yeah,
I think the difficulty would be sometimes online is that it's that between the people who genuinely believe it and people who are grifters, essentially, that they, for want of a better word, they just try to trigger someone. That a lot of the times you find, not always, but some people are not genuine in their views. You don't mind if someone has views like shared by the BNP, at least you can say, I may not agree with you, but let's have a discussion with this. Yeah. Problem with online, clicks sell. That sometimes people don't even have those views, but they know that as much as they can have a heated discussion, it gets clicks, it gets shares, it gets likes. And that's the difficulty of knowing where the people who are genuine and where you can have a good discussion, and the ones who are there just to trigger you and just to annoy you. And in which case, the difficulty is that's just wasting all of our times, because it's not from a genuine place, that it's just done there just for monetary reasons, possibly because they've got clicks and a business model that rewards them. And there are people online, especially in America, because they're just professionals at it, of people like the Dave Rubins and Ben Shapiro's, of where, and especially with someone like a Dave Rubin, I don't think he believes half the stuff that he's the nonsense that he's spouting, but it sells. And that's the difficulty, is who do we have a discussion with? And it's not always clear whether someone believes in some of their racism, for example, genuinely. Maybe they do. Maybe there's a money incentive, like Katie Hopkins. It feels like she believes in what she's espousing, but equally it sells, and she gets book deals or whatever else that comes with that. And online can be hard to kind of distinguish between the two groups.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it'd be naive for anyone to think, I'm going to go online and have a really lovely conversation, because it doesn't go like, or even in real life, like it doesn't go like that. That's just my approach. But like, I've also had very negative approaches trying to pursue that. People just don't want to have a discussion with you.
Yeah.
People don't want to look at you. So of course they're not going to want to sit with you. And so I acknowledge that as well. And I guess it is hard to control, to control my emotions in terms of like, if I get really angry at someone and what they've said, but it's always just reminding myself, like, that one person or that group, like, they're not going to make a difference to my life. And there is a block button online, which I'll happily press.
Exactly.
There's only so much you can kind of talk about and direct people towards. So I think from your information of, what books to read or podcasts to follow, or, all this online forums, is actually helping people who do want to learn. And then that in turn spreads the information of good quality information, rather than what people are seeing in 140 characters, for example.
Mm-hmm. No, I 100% agree. Social media, I say it's got its benefits, but at the same time, it is a very dangerous place to be for loads of reasons, so many numerous reasons. So it is being cautious about your use, because I think it can take its toll on our mental health massively, given how involved you are in it. So I think it's just, there's that cautiousness you need to be around social media. And again, don't believe in everything you see until you actually do your own. And there's this massive thing with, like, I've done my research, but going on YouTube, looking at a couple of videos isn't research. Like, research is really being a critical thinker. I think my biggest advice would be a critical thinker. And that is one aspect that a lot of people miss, is they're not critical enough in their thinking. And they'll judge very quickly. And again, judging very quickly is a human behavior, but it's fighting against that norm again, fighting against a normal instinct to just judge quick. But be a critical thinker.
Mm-hmm. Good point. I'm going to take it back to a quick fire, though. I don't know if it's going to be a quick fire, so no pressure. But actually taking on the information from social media and the restrictions that we've got in certain countries, wherever you're listening, all over the world. But due to the pandemic and the restrictions that people have got, what advice would you give, what recommendations would you give to individuals who are unable to play their sport, and how can they support their own mental health and well-being?
I think my first advice would be to not to put too much pressure on yourself, and to accept that things are going to be different. It's easier said than done, but I think having things written down, you've already manifested it in a written form. And so say if and start small. So for example, if you're like, oh, I really need to get a 5K run in, start small and just put down on paper, I want to go out for 1K walk, I want to go out for a half an hour walk. And I think it really is the small steps that counts, rather than the large leaps, given we're in a pandemic. And I think people need to realize we are in a pandemic still. It's still not over yet. The virus is still increasing across the globe. And to take that pressure off yourself, if you haven't managed to play your sport, that's okay. We're in a pandemic. People need to understand, like, a pandemic is literally a virus that is very quickly killing a lot of people. So I know it's not the same for everyone. My strategy is that I'm grateful. I just always remind myself I'm grateful to be able to breathe, to be able to see, to be able to feel, to be able to hear, to have my senses, to have a roof over my head, to have food in my belly. You know, anything else apart from those things is a privilege to have. But again, you know, that won't work for someone who may be experiencing symptoms of depression. And so understand that. So get down to the basics. Try and get out of bed if you can. Put on some clean clothes. Wash your face. That's enough for the day. You know, then get back into bed. So it really is the small stuff. And it just comes down to where you are in your life. And don't compare yourself with other people, because no one's in your position. And I think I struggle with that, especially because I have a twin sister. And so the comparison has always been there. But it's always about, for me, you know, just, I don't even compare myself to myself. Like if I've done a really great run last week, and yet I'm coming up to another week and I'm not feeling great, I acknowledge that feeling, and I allow it to be, because it is what it is, and we're in a pandemic. So that would be my main advice. And I think you don't necessarily have to like go out for a run. Literally moving your body is the exercise on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Just move, literally just move in any way you can, and in any way that suits you.
Shakiba, I'll ask you like a very kind of tangent off, kind of relating to what you said in terms of the sport, because you said obviously are you an amateur or a professional boxer right now? Professional, amateur. So obviously boxing's been a huge part of your life. If anyone, for example, if you were to pick your best 5 fights of all time, of where someone gets an actual like introduction into the sport, whether it's a young person or an old person just wants to watch the sport and maybe hopefully take it up as an actual hobby, maybe, or more, who would you say, well, what fights would you say for you have been kind of like maybe shaped your life, maybe you saw at a young age, or you're like go-to on YouTube every kind of time that you're bored and you just think, I'm going to watch this fight? Are there particular fights that you kind of, you always look back at fondly?
Yeah, for me, I actually watched a lot of amateur fights.
Okay.
And when I started boxing, Katie Taylor was still in amateurs. And so I watched a lot of Katie Taylor's like Olympic fights. I still watch a lot of Sandy Ryan's. She's in the GB group. Those two, for me, I've watched them ever since I started boxing, and it was just really fascinating to see. There's a female boxer, she's from India, at the 51 kilograms category. I've always watched her fights, really fascinated by her, Mary Com. There's like a film app on her now. And she's been boxing for years, and I think she's a great inspiration for anyone. It doesn't even have to be a female. And then I've also watched a lot of Gennady, they call him Triple G, Golovkin, yeah. I know, as Triple G. I watched a lot of his amateur fights, let alone professional. I think if you watch any of his professional fights, especially his more recent stuff, I love the fight with Kell Brook. I like his patience. I like the way he was so tactical. But also, I watched a lot of UFC, and so Khabib, I really struggle with his name, Nurmagomedov.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. It's a mouthful. Yeah, it's an absolute mouthful. Yeah.
Any justice there, but Khabib is one of my all-time favorite fighters, and his fight with Conor McGregor was one of the best by far. He also won me £250 because I bet I had a free bet, and my partner said, you have a free bet, and I said round 4 rear naked choke guarantee. And it happened. So yeah, that was one of my favorite fights, just because of how I actually lost my voice the next day because I was screaming so much at the screen. So those would be my go-to fights. To be honest, I just love watching any female bout. Terry Harper at the moment is really upcoming, and I've really enjoyed watching her rise to the top. And her story is really fascinating. You know, she was this young female in a fish and chip shop, and now she's on the world stage, competing against the best. My friend Ramla Ali, I've known her since my amateurs. I met her at one of our national competitions, and it's really nice because I felt like we were always in the same shows, and we all saw each other before and after the fights. And now she's on the professional level as well, and she also represents Somalia. So it's been really, it's been amazing watching everyone, those group of boxers kind of climb the ranks, and just, you don't even need to be climbing the ranks, just being present there is like fascinating for me.
Those are great answers. I'm going to have to start watching it now and start watching all these amateur boxing fights that you've just recommended. But brilliant. Thank you so much for all of that. Firstly, thank you so much for being a guest and taking time out as well to speak to us. But we always end our podcast asking our guests, if you could pick one person, and it could be a family member, it could be a professional, it could be somebody of influence. You could know them, you could not, but who would you recommend as a guest to be on Unapologetically You next? If you were to listen to our podcast, who would you want to hear from?
I'd actually want to hear from my twin sister, because I've never heard her, and she has heard me on so many podcasts now, especially because after being on SAS Who Dares Wins, I did it was just podcast after podcast, and I was just like, hey, check me out, I'm on here. And I feel like she's listening to me, but I've always actually wondered, how would she be in a podcast? And so I would love to hear from my twin. And of course, we have very similar, but also very different perspectives on a lot of things.
Yeah.
I speak to her every day, so it's not like I don't hear from her or anything, but I would just love to see what she's like in a podcast, just so we can make fun of each other later on.
Well, I was going to say, that'll bring out the competitive side of someone saying, look, mine got more clicks, mine was far more interesting. It's the competitive side in both of you then.
Yeah, not that she would, I think we dropped that years ago now, but it would just be so funny, I don't know, just to hear her talk. And I'm sure if she listened to this, she'll be like, oh, I really agreed with that, but you know what, this actually, I think you should have said this. And it will be just interesting, just to hear her perspective on a lot of topics that we discuss, because we are very similar, but at the same time, our roots into education and stuff were different as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's a terrific example of a guest.
Yeah.
I cannot wait to get her on. This is going to be fantastic. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me, both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure.
Pleasure's all ours. Thank you again.